of the College of Economics and Management, and she is joined by Professor Renen Silardo, also from the same college. Would like to recognize the presence of the College of Economics and Management students of UPLB. Welcome. You know, Dr. Warr, some of them were my students in the first virtual class, my first virtual class in UPLB, and it's so nice to see you after 2 years. So mabuhay and welcome to SEARCA. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you all to SEARCA at the Special Science and Nature City of Los Baños, Laguna, Philippines. This event marks a new chapter for SEARCA's Agriculture and Development Seminar Series, or what we fondly call as ADSS. As we bring back face-to-face learning and knowledge events complemented by SEARCA's online platforms. We are also seen right now at the Facebook page of SEARCA. For your information, our last in-person ADSS was held last March 2020, or more than 2 years ago. SEARCA remains committed in developing learning and knowledge events that will facilitate the wide sharing and best practices, practical and useful technologies, effective mindsets, and successes and lessons learned among stakeholders in agricultural and rural development systems. We are very honored to have Dr. Peter Warr from the Australian National University to be our very first speaker in this series. He was also with us yesterday as the author of Chapter 4 in the SEARCA co-publication titled Pro-Poor Development Policies, Lessons from the Philippines and East Asia. That book was launched publicly yesterday at the Philippine Economic Society's 60th annual meeting and conference at Novotel Hotel, and I was there. His chapter is titled Beyond Krugman, The Importance of Agriculture for East Asian Growth, which is actually one of his presentations this afternoon. As I told you earlier, I was at Novotel yesterday and I listened to his speech. And I cannot forget, Dr. Warr, when you mentioned The Myth of Asia's Miracle by Paul Krugman. So wait for it later. Very, very exciting. I would like to take this opportunity to thank you all for joining this afternoon session. Again, on behalf of SEARCA's director, Dr. Glenn B. Gregorio, it is my pleasure to welcome you all. Magandang hapon and mabuhay po sa inyong lahat. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergio. We're going to change the agenda a little bit to what you're seeing on the paper. We will now go straight to the introduction of our esteemed speaker. I have now the pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Peter Warr, who is the John Crawford Professor Emeritus of Agriculture Economics at the Australian National University. He studied at the University of Sydney, the London School of Economics, and Stanford University, where he received his PhD in applied economics. His current research is on the relationship between economic policy and poverty incidence in Southeast Asia. He is a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia and is a distinguished fellow and past president of the Australian Agricultural and Resource Economics Society. And from what I have gleaned hanging out with him over the past 2-3 days, he is an economist who doesn't take himself too seriously. He is actually married to a Thai national, so I guess that kind of makes it, it explains his interest in Southeast Asia. And he will tell a joke or two. So something that economists are not always as serious as we think they are. So ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome, Los Baños welcome to Dr. Peter Warr.
Thank you very much, Joe and Benedict. Magandang hapon sa iyong lahat. Kumusta kayo? Ang pangalan ko ay Peter Warr. Ako ay Australiano sa Canberra, sa Australia. Ako ay professor ng economics sa Australian National University. Ubos na ang Tagalog ko. Tapos, Ingles na lang. Thank you very much to SEARCA and the organizers, Benedict and Joe, and all of the SEARCA staff for the wonderful reception they have given to me for my visit. I feel greatly honored to have been the first speaker in the newly re-inaugurated program of direct in-person presentations. I think in-person presentations are quite important because we get a feeling for what it's like to be a professional economist. Are all of you economics students, agricultural economics students? Please put up your hand if you are an economics or agricultural economics student, please. Wow, lahat na tao. Okay, that's great. So now, yes, Benedict put up his hand too. That's good. Now, there are two topics that I'm going to talk about today. I can't see the screen without turning to the side a little bit, and I need to see the screen from time to time. But I'm going to use the clicker to control the slides myself. Let's hope this gadget works. First topic I want to talk about, this presentation will be relatively brief compared with the second one. So it's like a double feature at the movies. We have the first presentation, that's just the introductory one. And that's the B movie. And then we'll have an intermission. We might have some SEARCA video propaganda shown during the intermission. And I'll even tell you a joke about economists. You have to wait for that one. And then we'll do the second one, that will be the main feature. And that will be the presentation that's about land reform in Myanmar. Now you notice that I'm not talking about the Philippines at all in either presentation. First presentation will be about Indonesia and Thailand. You already know the reason why Thailand is my favorite country in Asia. I make no apologies for that. So that's my first topic. It's about the work of Professor Paul Krugman on Asia's economic miracle. And guess what? It doesn't work. So we need to go to the first slide. As I said, to see the screen myself, I have to turn a little bit to the side. I think if I stand over here, that will be best. Oh, I would have to point it this way, wouldn't I, to make it work? So maybe that's my problem. That's still not working. Please go to the first slide so I can start talking while you're doing that. Okay, wait, over there. I should point it that way. Point the clicker that way. Okay. Is it working now? Okay. So this is the first of those two presentations that I mentioned. Beyond Krugman. Krugman means Professor Paul Krugman. Now, I'm addressing a very big question. The question is, what caused Asia's economic growth? Asia's economic growth has been a tremendous event for the world economy. You couldn't have a much bigger question than that. And my starting point in the cause of economic growth is a paper that was written or published anyway in 1957. Hardly any of you were born yet, but I was already 10 years old. 1957, Professor Robert Solow published a paper that invented the field of growth accounting. And by the way, at the end of the presentation, I will tell you my email address. If you want copies of the slides, all you have to do is send me an email message. I will send you a copy of the slides. You don't need to make notes. And I will also send you a copy of the paper, which is in the book, which is a fuller explanation of my presentation today than I can give in this short presentation here. I hope SEARCA doesn't sue me for copyright violation, because I'm going to give it to you libre. Now, Robert Solow invented the field of growth accounting. Growth accounting is basically the distinction between the growth of output, which is due to increasing the quantity of inputs per head of population. So that means increase the quantity of inputs, labor, capital, and land. What do I mean by increasing the quantity of labor per head of population? Aren't they the same thing? No. Labor force participation means the proportion of the population who are employed in the workforce. So increasing labor per head of population means increasing labor force participation. So Solow was talking about the distinction between that, increasing the quantity of inputs per head of population on the one hand, and increasing the amount of output that you get per unit of those inputs on the other hand. That was the distinction that underlay Robert Solow's analysis of the sources of economic growth. And Solow came up with a really quite shocking answer. His answer was that of all the sources of economic growth, after he accounted for the labor force participation, capital increase, use of land per head of population, that explained 12.5% of US growth over some longish period before 1957. I forget which years exactly came into his data. 12.5%, not much of an explanation. The rest of it, the other 87.5%, was what Solow called an unexplained residual. Unexplained residual. So his theory of economic growth was really a very poor theory, because it only explained, the explained part was only 12.5%, and the unexplained part, the residual, was 87.5%. So if you submit a term paper with a theory like that, you'll get an F for that paper. I'm sorry to say, but Solow got the Nobel Prize. How about that? The unexplained residual, Solow called that technical progress. But that was just his word for the part that he couldn't explain, 87.5%. Now, one of Professor Robert Solow's most successful students was Paul Krugman. Paul Krugman also got the Nobel Prize, and he's one of the most creative economists we have in the world today. He's not only a brilliant analyst, but he's also a terrific writer. You can download his columns from the New York Times free of charge. His columns are terrific, well worth reading. He hates the Republican Party in the United States. So you need to know that in advance, but he's a terrific writer, Professor Paul Krugman. In 1994, Professor Paul Krugman published an article in the American magazine Foreign Affairs, which is one of the most widely read and widely cited articles written by an economist ever. It was called The Myth of Asia's Miracle. The citations to that article are unbelievably extensive. In this article, Krugman debunked a book that had just been published by the World Bank. The title of the book was Asia's Economic Miracle. It had just been published a year or two before 1994. Asia's Economic Miracle. And Krugman said, rubbish, rubbish. Krugman is an iconoclast. An iconoclast means someone who loves to destroy images, idols. Everyone was going like this to the World Bank theory of Asia's miracle. Krugman said, rubbish, rubbish. There was no miracle. There was no miracle. Actually, the explanation for what happened in Asia, the cause of growth, does not involve any miracles. It's really boringly conventional. Boringly conventional. And it was the opposite of what Professor Robert Solow had published in 1957 regarding the United States. He's a loyal student for Professor Solow, so he didn't say anything unkind about Professor Solow's earlier article, didn't dare, but his story was the exact opposite of what Solow said. Krugman said, for Asia, he distinguished between the first, he called the first part of Solow's story increasing the quantity of inputs per head of population. He called that perspiration, and increasing the amount of output that you get per unit of those inputs through technical change. He called that inspiration. Perspiration, inspiration. It took somebody as clever as Paul Krugman to think of that brilliant way of characterizing the difference between Solow's two components of economic growth: perspiration, inspiration. So Krugman said, if you account for all of the inputs that have been used to produce the output generated in Asia, there's nothing left over. There's no residual. The opposite of what Solow had said. There's no residual. So there's no inspiration left over. There was no inspiration behind Asia's growth, is what Krugman said. It's all perspiration. So Krugman went further with that and said, what this means is, by perspiration, Krugman meant these two things: increased labor participation, more labor per head of population, that first one, and adding physical and human capital to raw labor. Didn't mention land. That will be relevant for the rest of the subsequent story that we're going to discuss here. Never mentioned land. Perspiration meant those two things. Perspiration explained all of the increase in output. There was no room left over for any inspiration. Therefore, it's the exact opposite of what Solow had said about the United States. And what this meant, according to Krugman, was that this pattern of economic growth that had occurred in Asia could not be sustained indefinitely because of diminishing returns. keep on adding capital to labor, and you get declining marginal product of capital, human capital, physical capital, and the rate of growth must slow down. So this rapid Asian growth that had been occurring could not be sustained. That was Krugman's story. That's his famous article. And I'm going to try to tell you that Krugman was wrong. He got it wrong because he missed something really important. And that was agriculture. Now, what you need to know, by the way, I recommend that everyone read Krugman's article, 1994 issue of Foreign Exchange. Must be in the library here. I strongly recommend it. Not only is it really interesting, but so well written, so interesting. Like everything else that Krugman writes. He writes really superbly. It turns out, if you read the article, that the evidence for his story, that perspiration explains everything, came from some earlier studies written by some econometricians who were working on Singapore, Hong Kong, to a lesser extent, South Korea. Mainly Singapore and Hong Kong. And in the article, Krugman talks mainly about Singapore. He'd spent a few weeks staying in a hotel in Singapore, so he thought that made him an expert on Asia. That was his knowledge of Asia was based on sitting in the hotel in Singapore, looking out the window from the 35th floor. That was his experience of Asia. Well, here's my point. These city-states, Singapore, Hong Kong, they were the studies that were used by the earlier scholars, Lawrence Lau, another scholar whose name was Kim Jong-il, not the former dictator of North Korea, another Korean with the same name, but no relations as far as I know, and an MIT economists like Solow and Krugman. They both studied at MIT. Alwyn Young. These guys studied Singapore and Hong Kong. And their story about the sources of economic growth in Singapore and Hong Kong were the basis that Krugman used. It's quite clear from his article. He says so. This is where he got this evidence. They were the basis for his claim that perspiration is everything. Now, here's the problem. Singapore and Hong Kong are not typical of Asia. They have no agriculture. They import all their food. They're not typical of Asia in one very important respect, and that is there's no low productivity agricultural sector in Singapore or Hong Kong, zero. They are very atypical. So the question is, does that make a difference to Krugman's story? If he had had information about countries other than Singapore and Hong Kong, would his story have been different? Yes, I say it would have been very different. Now, in the early 1990s, many Asian countries were booming. Not China yet. China's boom really wasn't going at that time. Indonesia was booming. Thailand was booming. Philippines was having a pretty hard time in the first half of the 1990s. I think, study your own economic history, you know that. So Philippines was not booming, but certainly Singapore, Hong Kong, Thailand, Indonesia, Korea, Taiwan, these were the tigers. They were booming. But Krugman's story was based only on Singapore and Hong Kong. So in this paper, I have studied Thailand and Indonesia, two other booming economies, which Krugman never even mentions in his paper. I'm trying to look at whether the story that you would come up with for those two countries would be very different, from the story that Krugman had in his article. Now, let me pause for just a moment and say, sorry, but the Philippines is not part of my paper. Philippines actually wasn't booming at the time Krugman wrote his article, but since then, the Philippines has done very well, especially in recent years. So some of you may want to try to apply the kind of analysis that I've done here in this paper to the Philippines. If so, great. Please send, I'm going to give you my email address soon. Please send me a copy if you write a paper about that subject. It'll be a good idea. I'd really encourage you to consider that. I'm going to say that based on the evidence for Indonesia and Thailand, which I'm going to present to you, the movement of people out of low productivity agriculture into higher productivity industry and services sectors is a source of economic growth that Krugman left out. And it turns out to be a major contributor to the economic growth of Thailand and Indonesia. It's not perspiration. It's not inspiration. It's a third category, which I'll explain more fully in a few minutes. I think I need to point it that way. Go back. Right. Mustn't keep touching that. Okay, so this table has a little bit of background about structural change in Thailand and Indonesia. This first column here is the mean annual rate of change of agriculture's percent contribution to GDP. We're going to see some more data in a minute, but this table summarizes structural change in Thailand and Indonesia. So you see 0.39%, that's the mean annual change in agriculture's share of GDP. Structural transformation was a big deal in these economies with large agricultural sectors, a really big deal. Agriculture contracted as economic growth occurred, and the people who left agriculture went to industry and services. Okay, so if we look in terms of output share, that means output means GDP here. Someone tell us, now we have a test. Someone tell us, what does GDP mean? Sorry, you're talking with your mother on the telephone. And she said, what did you study today in your class? Or GDP. She says, sorry, what is GDP? What do you say to your mother? What is G? What does G mean? What does D mean? What does P mean? Someone volunteer an answer, please, or I have to pick on you. Don't make me do that. Someone volunteer an answer. What is GDP? Mother is asking you. Hey, look, I'm spending all this money to send you to UP Los Baños, and I'm asking you, what's GDP? Explain it to me. All right, the gentleman in the white T-shirt back there, do you know what GDP means? You, sir, with the mask. Yeah. Sige. No. Okay. GDP. Okay. So I won't embarrass anybody else with that. Gross domestic product. Product means output. The P is easy. The D, domestic, that means produced by people within the country itself, not foreigners. What does the G stand for? What? Gross. What does gross mean? Mother is waiting on the telephone, and this call is costing money. So, in there. Sorry, you need to know this. Gross means there is no allowance for depreciation. When you produce output, you use the capital and the labor and the land. And particularly the physical capital that you use is partly worn out in the process of producing the output. That's depreciation. Gross domestic product makes no allowance for depreciation of the capital. That's what gross means. It does not mean total. Total is combined in the word D, the domestic. It adds up the output of all of the domestic people. But gross means no allowance for depreciation of physical capital. So a little aside, a footnote now. Everyone's talking about green GDP. Green GDP has to mean that the concept of depreciation is extended to natural capital, the forest and the air and the water and the land itself. When we produce output, we depreciate those things as well. So green GDP would allow for depreciation of those things. When we allow for depreciation, that's called net domestic product. So to figure out what the word gross means, you have to ask yourself, what would net mean? Because the opposite of gross is net. Net means subtracting the cost of depreciation from total domestic product. That's GDP. Okay. Your professors are going to ask you, what is the definition of GDP? So please know that. Okay, now look at this. How much of the output share was, if the share of agriculture goes down by, say, 100 units, GDP share, there must be an increase in the share of industry and services that add up to 100. That's mathematically required. So what was the share of the contraction of GDP that was absorbed by industry and services? In Indonesia, industry absorbed 33%. That means services expanded by 67%. Has to. If the contraction in agriculture's share of GDP is 100, industry goes up by 33, then services must go up by 67. So the expansion of services as a share of GDP in Indonesia, in Thailand, I beg your pardon, Thailand, expansion of services was 2/3 of the contraction of agriculture. In Indonesia, the expansion of industry, as agriculture contracted, the expansion of industry was nothing. Its share didn't go up at all. It all went into services. Now, we're inclined to talk about this process of structural change. Agriculture contracts, other sectors expand. We tend to call that industrialization. But that's a really misleading thing to say. Because in Thailand, industry expanded by only 1/3 of the contraction of agriculture. Services expanded by 2/3 of that contraction, twice as much. And in Indonesia, services was all of the expansion. Indonesia didn't expand as a share of GDP at all. Now, it's even more simple if we look at employment. There I was talking about output. I think Nobody knew what GDP meant, but everybody does know what employment means. So I won't have to ask anybody to explain what that is. Here's the contraction of agriculture's annual employment share. It went down a little bit faster in Thailand than it did in Indonesia, but each year it went down. So the story is simplest for Thailand. In each year, agriculture's share of total employment went down by an average of 1%. The data relate to the period 1981 to 2017, average of 1%. So each year, agriculture's share of total employment went down from numbers like 26% to 25%. Then the next year, 25% to 24%. On average, was about 1% a year. Now, of every 100 people who left employment in agriculture, where did they go? The answer is really simple. For every 100 people who left employment in agriculture in Thailand, 34 went to industry. And where did the other 66 go? Services. There's no significant unemployment in Thailand. You can't afford to be unemployed in Thailand. No, so everybody who leaves agriculture finds a job doing something. 34 of every 100 ended up in industry. The other 66 ended up in services. And in Indonesia, it's almost the same. 32 ended up in industry, and the other 68 ended up in services. Right, so this is the point that I wanted to make in this table. Should we call that industrialization? I don't think so. We need a new word for it. It's something like servicization or some word like that. We don't have the word. No one's invented the word to describe this process of, it's really services that expanded much more than industry. Oops. Stop. Right. Here's the data that underlie that very story that I just told you. Here's GDP shares. This is Thailand, and this is Indonesia. And at the bottom is agriculture. Agriculture contracting as a share of GDP, and there's industry, and there's services. Agriculture contracted a lot. What sector expanded as a proportion of GDP? Well, mainly it was services. That's Thailand. Similar sort of thing, Indonesia. So that's GDP shares, and employment shares, it's even simpler. Employment shares. So there's agriculture's share of employment. In Thailand, go back to 1981, it was about 68% of the workforce who were employed in agriculture. 68%. And by the time you get to 2017, it's something like 30%. Remember that number? About 1% of the workforce left agriculture. 1% of the total workforce left agriculture on average each year. Where did they go? Mainly services. Only 1/3 of those people went to industry. The other 2/3 went to services. And similar kind of story for Indonesia. Here's the cover of that book. Obviously, the picture is taken from the Philippines. You see that the picture on the cover of the book, I claim it's about this thing that I just talked about. See this guy, this older gentleman, he's a farmer, obviously. And he is very affectionate towards the buffalo. When I first, that's the cover of our book, which just launched this week. When I first saw the picture, I thought, this picture tells us that this old man loves the buffalo. There's probably songs about it. Probably an old Tagalog song about how the guy loves the buffalo, that kind of thing. By the way, my favorite Tagalog song is Hindi Kita Malimo by Josefino Senizal. He passed away not too long ago. I love the old Tagalog songs. I'm sure there's a song about this. Love the buffalo. And when I thought further about the picture, I noticed that in the background, there's a tractor. So what's happening here is structural change is occurring in Philippine agriculture. Farm sizes are getting bigger. People are getting rid of their buffaloes, and they're getting tractors, and they're combining the farms. So there's the guy on the tractor in the background, which is going to replace the buffalo. And this gentleman is saying goodbye to the beloved buffalo, who's going to be sent off to some fate that's too terrible to go, too sad. I'm sure there's a song about it. There ought to be one if there isn't. So this cover of the book really captures this same process that we're talking about here, the contraction of agriculture and the expansion of industry and services. I won't need that. Didn't work anyway. Okay. Right. So now, enough for the romantic stories about agriculture. By the way, there are in every society, there is a culture that's all about this process. The process is people forced to leave agriculture, forced to leave rural areas for economic reasons and go to the city. They go to the city and they're not happy. So many of the old Tagalog songs are about that, longing for the countryside. They long for the countryside, but they had to leave to get a better job in the city, in industry or services in the city. So in the Philippines, many of the old Tagalog songs touching on this process. They left not only the farm and the farm animals, but the people in the village, their girlfriends and their boyfriends, they left them behind and they went away. Thailand, they have this same thing. In Europe, flamenco music in Spain is all about that. It's all about the process of people leaving agriculture, going to the city. In Portugal, there's a wonderful musical form called fado. Fado, F-A-D-O, which means fate in Portuguese. It's about this same process, longing for the countryside. And a feeling of malungkot, about the countryside and the people left behind, and a longing for the rural life, which is no longer possible for them for economic reasons. Back to economics. I want to distinguish three sources of economic growth of output per person. The first two, you already heard about them. First one is perspiration. That's what, and second one is inspiration. We just heard about them. Perspiration means growth of factor inputs, labor, physical capital, relative to population, increase of labor force participation, and more capital per head of population, both physical and human capital. Krugman called that perspiration. That's A, perspiration. B is what Krugman called inspiration. It's growth of the productivity of these factors through technical change. That's what Krugman called inspiration, and Solow called it the unexplained residual or technical progress. That's what Solow called it. There's a third one, which is totally irrelevant in Singapore and Hong Kong, because the third one does not occur there. It's the movement of people out of low productivity agriculture, kind of thing that this guy was doing on the farm there, low productivity agriculture, people moving out of that into higher productivity industry and services. Now, I'm oversimplifying when I say this, because over time, within agriculture, there's also structural transformation. People move from low productivity agriculture to higher productivity agriculture. That's important, that happens. And that raises productivity within agriculture. But I'm oversimplifying to make my main point, which is the reallocation of people from low productivity, low output per worker in agriculture to higher productivity activities in industry and services that raises total output. Now, if you're not convinced that C makes sense, if you're not convinced, let me try to persuade you that it must be true. Okay, so imagine the following thought experiment. The thought experiment is, suppose that perspiration was zero. There was none of it. Inspiration was zero. So there is no productivity growth in any sector of the economy. No perspiration, no inspiration within any sector, within agriculture, within industry, or within services. Zero productivity growth. Zero inspiration, zero perspiration. But that the level of productivity is lower in agriculture than it is in industry and services. Level. And over time, people move from low productivity agriculture to higher productivity industry and services. Because people move from a low productivity sector, low output per worker, to higher output per worker, output must go up. Total output must go up. GDP must go up. So there must be economic growth. Even though there's no perspiration and there's no inspiration in any sector. That's my thought experiment. So that proves that category C must be real, must be potentially important, but how important we can't tell just by theorizing. But you can see from the thought experiment that category C makes sense. Category C is a source of growth that is additional to the growth occurring within sectors due to perspiration and inspiration. Okay, now, when you read my paper, and of course, I'll get email messages from all of you asking for a copy of the paper so that you can study it carefully. Of course, when you read my paper, you will be able to study how the paper arrives at this table. This table is a decomposition of the sources of growth into category A plus B. I call that within sectors. Oops. Call that within sectors. Sorry. Categories A plus B, that's within sectors. And category C, which is between sectors. I'm not going to go through the mathematics of how that was done in the paper here. I'm not going to go through that here. You'll be pleased to say. But it's in the paper. And what's the answer? Okay, for Thailand, 53% of the economic growth that occurred, the growth of GDP per person in Thailand, 53% of that was due to A plus B, perspiration plus inspiration. I don't bother to distinguish them in this paper. A plus B. I'm not interested in Krugman's question of perspiration versus inspiration. I'm interested in how big is C, reallocation. And the other 40% is due to between sector productivity growth. That's reallocation. That's Thailand, my favorite country. And Indonesia, 72% was within sector perspiration plus inspiration, and 28% was due to the between sector. So in case you forgot what A, B, and C are, here they are again. Krugman talked about perspiration versus inspiration. For the United States, Solow in 1957 said, remember that perspiration was only 12.5% of American growth. Inspiration was 87.5%. Krugman said, well, Professor Solow, I'm not going to argue with you about the United States, but for Asia, according to the studies done by these earlier guys, who, by the way, looked only at Singapore and Hong Kong, for Asia, it's 100% perspiration, 0% inspiration. And I'm saying, okay, maybe that's true for Singapore and Hong Kong. Who cares? That's such a small part of Asia. For most of Asia, Krugman missed something really big. He missed C. C is reallocation of labor in particular, from low productivity agriculture to higher productivity industry and services. And that accounted for a big part of the economic growth that occurred in Thailand and Indonesia. In Thailand, it was almost half. C accounted for almost half, 47%. In Indonesia, a bit over a quarter, 28%. So that's a substantial part of economic growth. Well, Krugman got the Nobel Prize, not just for this article, but it was wrong. I'm waiting for my phone call from the Bank of Sweden to tell me about my Nobel Prize for this. I'm not holding my breath. Okay, that's the end of that's the end of this first paper. That's the end of the B movie. And now we have an intermission when we have some cold drink and eat some popcorn. And then the second feature will be coming soon.
Thank you, Peter. Well, take a break. I mean, I don't want to tire you out. You still have one more presentation to go. So actually, the intermission is going to be our talk earlier, because Peter and I were talking about the cover of the book. So I'm going to use which one's the pointer here? This one. So I think Peter said the farmer loves the buffalo, and he had two scenarios. So I told him I have a third scenario because my wife and my daughter all love their K-dramas or Korean novellas or whatnot. My take is there's a love triangle in this cover. There's a love triangle. So you know about the guy who loves his Carabao, but my take is, you see the guy driving the tractor? He's the guy who is out of the love of the couple. So he's the spurned lover or something, and he's gonna run over them with the tractor because he wasn't chosen to be with the Carabao. Anyway, moving on, we're gonna do another adjustment in the agenda you're holding. I would now like to call on Assistant Professor Arlene Gutierrez, who will give a message on behalf of the College of Economics and Management of the University of the Philippines of Los Baños, our co-partner in organizing this ADSS. Let's give her a warm applause.
Thank you very much, Bimbo. To SEARCA Deputy Director, Associate Professor Joselito Florendo, SEM faculty and students, and to our distinguished speaker, Dr. Peter Warr, a pleasant afternoon to all of you. It is a great honor to speak to you on behalf of the Dean of the College of Economics and Management, Dr. Agham Cuevas. The College of Economics and Management has always envisioned as an active catalyst for economic and social transformation by engaging minds and meaningful collaborations. When SEARCA approached us for this collaboration, the answer is an automatic yes. The Asia and the Pacific region have made numerous efforts and great strides toward reducing poverty and fostering economic growth. Despite these efforts, development challenges still remain. To name a few, these challenges include rapid urbanization, changing demographics, climate change, and technological advancement, all of which affects the agriculture sector. This seminar is very timely as it will provide us, or it provided us already, especially our students taking up BS Economics and BS Agricultural and Applied Economics, with great insights as well as new economic tools and techniques directed towards poverty-reducing potential of agricultural land reform and the importance of agriculture for growth. I'm sure some of you already have some idea for your possible research or even your thesis. Before I end this message, I would like to thank SEARCA for bringing us together here and for involving the College of Economics and Management in this endeavor. We look forward to more future collaborations between SEM and SEARCA, and we also look forward to working with you in engaging the minds of our younger generation, our SEM students, towards empowering agricultural development in our country. Thank you very much.
So let's give Peter another hand as he presents his second one, the poverty reducing potential of agricultural land reform evidence from Myanmar. Everyone, Peter Warr.
This one is about Myanmar, and I'm going to give this presentation in Thai. Can everyone understand Thai? No. All right then. Well, I'll use English. I told you I was going to tell a joke, so here's my joke. It's an economist joke. The worst thing about economists, is that they like this joke. It's a very negative joke about economists, but economists tend to like it. So the joke is the patient goes into the hospital, doesn't feel too well, and the doctors check him out, and they say, well, there's bad news and there's good news. The bad news is you're very sick. You need a heart transplant. The good news is there's 2 available donors and you can choose. The first donor is a 25-year-old triathlete. And the second donor is a 65-year-old economist, even older than me, by the way. 65-year-old economist. The patient said, no problem. I'll take the economist because that heart won't have been used, will it? Economists like that joke. I don't know why. So the second presentation I want to give, and this is my favorite of the 2. It's about Myanmar. I have been to Myanmar many times over the years. Honestly, I feel heartbroken about current events in Myanmar. Heartbroken because it's so very tragic what's occurring in that country. Well, I had a PhD student from Myanmar studying with me not too long ago, and she obtained a very good data set on Myanmar. And we used it in a couple of papers about Myanmar. And in this paper, I'm using that same data set. She was busy doing other stuff and wasn't able to join me in this particular paper, but we're using the data that she was able to obtain. The data are a survey of households in Myanmar, of which there are 11,172 households involved in agriculture in Myanmar. That's only a part of the total data set. The total data set is 18,000 households plus something. And the year of the data was 2010. So the data are 12 years old already. Before the military took over, they took over just February of last year. But this was 12 years ago that this data relate to. Okay, so the question is about land reform in Myanmar. What would be the capacity, the potential for land reform in Myanmar to reduce poverty incidence? Poverty incidence is a big deal in Myanmar. If you visit rural areas of Myanmar, you see what I'm talking about. Rural Myanmar looks like what rural Philippines looked like in the 1950s, maybe. Like that. It's poor. It's poor. People are struggling, really struggling. Right. Here's my outline. I'm going to tell you the various topics that I'm going to try to cover in this presentation. Now, I notice that when I'm presenting, nobody asks a question, nobody challenges me. You know what? In Australia and the United States and Britain and France and Germany and so on, that's not the custom. The custom is you interrupt the professor and say, "Professor, what about this? I'm not so sure you're right about that. What's your evidence for that?" This is not the Philippines. Quite honestly, it's not Thailand either, and it's not Indonesia, and it's not Myanmar. They don't interrupt there either, but they ought to. So I wish you would interrupt and challenge me, ask questions. If something's not clear, interrupt me and tell me that something's not clear. If you want to argue, disagree, please go right ahead. That's my culture where I come from. I understand that it's not your culture necessarily. So feel free to interrupt me anytime. First topic I'm going to talk about is what I mean by land reform. Second topic, I'm going to talk about Professor Michael Lipton. So here I am. I'm attacking all the greats of our profession. I attacked Paul Krugman in the first of the B movie, and now in the A movie, I'm attacking Professor Michael Lipton, who's another great of the development economics profession. If you happen to have your mobile phone, you can Google Michael Lipton, and you'll see what an important person he is in the field of development economics. Really, it's been an immensely important contributor to that subject of development economics. I'm going to disagree with Professor Michael Lipton. And then I'm going to tell you what my research question is. By the way, I'm going to explain to you in 2 sentences what research is. Research is 1, ask a question. The question has to be interesting, has to be important. They're almost the same thing, but not quite the same thing. Ask a question. Second, answer it. Now, in your studies, you learn all about how to answer a question. You study economic theory, you study econometrics, study economic history and so on. It's all about the method of answering a question. But the most important thing in economic research is to ask a good question. Ask a good question. So when I'm talking with students doing research in economics, the first thing I say to them always is, what's your question? If they have a question, they give me one sentence that ends in a question mark. That's what I want. If they say, well, I'm interested in blah, 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 and the topic of and blah, blah, and I read this article by, that's not a question. You have not got to the question if that's the way you answer. Now, the process of getting to the question, that's so important and it takes time. But understand that when you begin your research in economics, you're writing a thesis or an essay for a course or something like that. Your first task is ask a good question. It takes time, not one day, several days, maybe weeks. Do some reading, talk with people, try candidate questions, ask the good question. That's the most important determinant of how good the research will be. If the question isn't interesting and important and capable of being answered, you'll produce lousy research. That's the fact. You must have a question that's interesting, important, and capable of being answered. So if, when I tell you my question, you're not impressed, that means the paper that you're going to hear from me will be lousy, because the question determines the quality of the research that you do. In your studies, you learn technique about answering questions. You must have the technique. That's very important. You can't answer a question unless you have good methodology and learn your econometrics, learn your mathematics and your economic theory. But none of that is of any value at all unless you ask a good question to start with. I'm going to talk about, whoops, I clicked that and it was a mistake. Yes. I'm going to talk about measurement of poverty incidence in Myanmar. I'm going to show you the data on poverty incidence in Myanmar. I'm going to tell you my methodology. That's how I answer the question. And then I'm going to show you my results, and I'm going to summarize all of it. Okay, so first, what is land reform? I read a lot of literature about land reform, including land reform here in the Philippines, but I'm not going to talk about the Philippines, maybe until we get to the question time, and maybe some of you will have some comment or some question about land reform in the Philippines. That's great. Leave it till the end, please. I'm going to tell you about Myanmar first. What is land reform? Well, I found out in reading the literature about land reform that it means three different things that are not the same. They are contradictory. First meaning of land reform is reducing inequality of land ownership so as to reduce poverty. That is the definition that was given to the subject of land reform by Professor Michael Lipton. There's his book, Land Reform in Developing Countries, a great book. If you're interested in land reform in the Philippines, check out this book from the library. Don't buy it, it costs a fortune. And study it, because there's a lot of relevant information in this book about your country. That's what Michael Lipton means by land reform. Make land ownership per household more equal, and that way you'll reduce poverty. That's his story. Second meaning is improve the security of tenure of farmers and thereby raise productivity. So whereas the first meaning is about redistribution of land among households, the second is not about redistribution at all. It's about making the tenure of land more secure. Why would that raise productivity? Someone tell me. Why would anyone care about that? Improve the security of tenure. Someone volunteer and answer, please. I promise to be kind. I won't be as unkind as I was to the gentleman I disagreed with earlier. I promise. Someone, why would that raise productivity? Please. Yeah, right. They would get the product of what they do. For example, it would encourage investment in them. Right. I'm sorry, I can't hear you. So, yeah. Yeah.
Number one, but I think we need a further step before we can reduce poverty. And the link between land ownership and poverty is, I think it's missing something.
Yeah. That's the subject of the seminar. Trust me.
Questions about whether these conditions are equity, the purpose of land reform.
Yeah.
Two opposing camps. I think Professor Mahar can also say it's not efficient. I'm not sure if it's not efficiency, but rather equity issues of what we want to address when we had what we had available before. So I find it hard to get the link between. I mean, there's a missing link.
Thank you, Professor. Sige. Maybe that would be a distraction at the end, please. Right. So I agree entirely. There's a missing link. We'll be discussing that. Why would improving the security of tenure raise productivity? Because if you know that you can keep the land and no one can take it from you, you have an incentive to invest. Investment means give up something now to get something in the future. But if you don't have the surety, the assurance that you can keep the land in the future, then you don't have the incentive to invest in it now. What I mean by investment: make rice paddy, install irrigation systems, control weeds, that kind of thing. Security of tenure encourages investment. Economists emphasize this point. That's point two. Because they think that it promotes productivity. So when economists talk about land reform, they tend to mean two. But two and one are not the same thing. Because suppose the government is saying, well, we're thinking about reallocating land among households so that we can make it more equal, so that we can reduce poverty. Does that improve security of tenure or lower it? Lowers it. Because the government's saying, we're thinking about taking land away from the big guys and giving it to the small guys. So everybody feels less secure, particularly the big guys. So that reduces. So one reduces security of tenure. One and two are contradictory. They are opposing. They're in opposition to each other. Now, in the literature on Myanmar, this is Myanmar specific, I found out that the Myanmar people are mainly talking about something entirely different. They're talking about past injustice. Past injustices were cases where big landholders captured the land from small landholders. It's called land grabbing. Big businesses, maybe who didn't own any land at all, grabbed the land from smallholders and dispossess them, kick them off. And the government does nothing about it. The police do nothing about it. So that was past injustice. Redressing past injustice is not the same as one, it's not the same as two, it's different. That's the Myanmar literature. So there are these three meanings for land reform in the literature. I mean one. I'm talking about one. And this is what Michael Lipton calls classic land reform. I'm going to call it redistributive land reform to make sure that you understand it's not the same as two, it's not the same as three. Right. It has to think. That's Michael Lipton on land reform. There's his book. I just showed it to you. Great book. I recommend reading it. In my opinion, Michael Lipton misses that link that the professor was mentioning before. Misses the link. In the book, Michael Lipton never tells us how much poverty reduction we could get by making land ownership more equal. He just says that we could reduce poverty. And he doesn't talk about that missing link. How does he fill up the book if he doesn't talk about those things? That's a good question. Well, here's what he says. They are land reforms. This is the very first paragraph of his book. Land reforms are laws that are intended and likely to cut poverty by raising the poor's share of land rights. Point is that land reform matters mainly for its effect on poor people. It's the link between land reform, redistribution, and poverty. That's his theme. That's Michael Lipton. And that's what I will mean by land reform here too. Well, in the introductory part of the book, many of the greats of economics, you can see that I love attacking the greats of our profession. I love criticizing my betters. And I'm going to do that now. So in the book, many distinguished economists endorse the book and say how great land reform is for reducing poverty. Jeffrey Sachs, ever heard of Jeffrey Sachs? Amartya Sen. By the way, I was a student of Amartya Sen at the London School of Economics. I'm proud to say what a wonderful teacher he was. We all loved him. I mean that most sincerely. Joachim von Braun, Ricardo Hausmann, Gordon Conway, Nancy Birdsall, Paul Collier, Nicholas Stern, they all say, great book, really important. They all say that. Amartya Sen says, land reform can make a huge contribution in removing poverty, but it has not been effectively tried in many areas of the world. So there's great scope for reducing poverty through land reform as defined by Michael Lipton. And what's his definition? Well, there it is. By the way, here I am criticizing my former professor, Amartya Sen. I'm going to say something quite different from what Sen said. This is the tradition of Australia, Britain, United States. It's okay to criticize your professor. It's okay. I get the impression this is not the tradition here in the Philippines. It's not okay to criticize your professor. It's your country, but our tradition is that it's by disagreeing with your professor, it means you have thought carefully about what the professor said, and you've looked at the evidence and you have considered an argument. So, my question, Sorry about the delay in here. Please. Right. I'm going to ask, what is the maximum amount that equalizing the distribution of land or making it more equal, what is the maximum extent to which that could hypothetically, conceivably reduce poverty? The upper bound on all that reduction. Any practical land reform could not achieve that. It must reduce it by less than that. I'm going to try to find the maximum. And I'm going to say the maximum is not much. That's going to be my conclusion. Therefore, I'm going to conclude, I'm telling you my answer right now. Therefore, land reform is not necessarily, in the case of Myanmar, an effective way of reducing poverty. There are other better ways of reducing it than land reform. Don't put all your resources into land reform because it won't achieve much. That's going to be my bottom line. We're going to study this in the context of Myanmar, as I said. And here's that survey that I just told you about. 11,172 households involved in agricultural production in 2010. Of those 11,172, 9,025 own or rent land, so they're actual farmers, and 2,147 are landless. That means they don't own or rent land themselves, but they're involved in agriculture, so they work for these guys on the land owned or rented by the 9,025. I hope those two numbers add up to 11,172. Right. A little bit of background. When you look at the World Bank's work on Myanmar, as for just about every other country, is what you find out. I don't work for the World Bank, by the way. You'll soon see that. The World Bank doesn't pay me, so I feel free to criticize them. Every country where the World Bank is involved, they produce a poverty profile. And in the introduction to the poverty profile, some very distinguished person will say, here in this poverty profile for Myanmar, Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines, Laos, Cambodia, any other country, developing country. In this poverty profile, we're going to find out the drivers of poverty, What they really do is this. They have this survey in which they find out that of all the non-poor, 88% own land and 12% are landless, don't own land. So among the non-poor, the proportion who own land is much higher than the proportion who don't. And among the poor, 77% own land and 23% are landless. So we're encouraged to think that the poverty profile reveals to us that owning land helps you to be non-poor. And here's another bit. I've copied these directly from the Myanmar poverty profile produced by the World Bank. If the World Bank ever sees a recording of this seminar, I will never get another job with another consultancy with the World Bank again. I'll be finished. Anyway, so here's another example of the same sort of thing. Of the non-poor, 71% have a title for the land that they cultivate. And among the poor, only 51%. So having the title to land cultivated helps you to be non-poor. That's the conclusion that we get out of that. That's the conclusion that the World Bank poverty profile encourages to make. And same thing, title for dwelling, whether someone in the household has a bank account, higher among the non-poor. Look at how small these numbers are in Myanmar, by the way. Look at that. The proportion of people portion of households where someone in the household has a bank account in the entire population, 15.7% has a bank account. That's all. What about the other 84.3%? No one has a bank account. Okay, so do you buy that? That's the poverty profile. It's telling us about the drivers of poverty, right? Is it really telling us that? Lady in the pink jacket, what do you think?
Expected comments on the ownership of a bank account. In my country, I come from Zimbabwe in Africa. We also had a land reform at some point, and I would say it was disastrous. But on the fact that ownership of a bank account reflects whether you are poor or rich, it's meaningless where I come from. Because we can have very rich people, but they don't put their money in the banks because they want to avoid taxes and they want to avoid even like being labeled, maybe how, or being investigated on how they are accumulated that wealth. Nothing to do with whether you're poor. Right? Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you. I agree with you.
Suppose I told you this. In the survey, one of the questions that they asked was, do you have color TV at home? Do you have color TV? What we find out is the non-poor, yes, they have color TV. And the poor, no, they don't have color TV. Would this tell us that having color TV causes you to be non-poor? Suppose I told you, and they'd ask another question. Did you eat ice cream in the last week? Did you eat ice cream? And among the non-poor, the proportion who ate ice cream in the last week was much higher than the proportion of the poor who ate ice cream in the last week. Would that tell us that eating ice cream causes you to be non-poor? That would be silly, because eating ice cream doesn't cause you to be non-poor. It's being non-poor causes you to eat ice cream. Being non-poor causes you to have color TV. Maybe being non-poor causes you to have a bank account, have a legal title for dwelling, have a legal title for your land. What's causing what? We can't tell from the poverty profile. That's my point. We can't tell. The poverty profile is not about the drivers of poverty. That's wrong. It's about the correlates of poverty. It's a description of the poor, not an analysis of what causes poverty, not an analysis of what causes it. So therein is the big problem of economics. The big problem is what's causing what. Take education. Another set of questions in the poverty profile is always about education. The non-poor have better education than the poor. Does having better education cause you to be non-poor? So having less education causes you to be poor? Or is it that being poor causes you to have less education? They're correlated, but what causes what? That's the research question, and the poverty profile doesn't tell us the answer. It only tells us what's correlated with what. It doesn't tell us what causes what. But for policy, the government doesn't need to know what's correlated with what. It needs to know causality. It needs to know, if we give people subsidized ice cream, will that help them to be non-poor? No. If we subsidize color TV, will that help them to be non-poor? No. Even though those things are correlated with being non-poor, eating ice cream, having color TV, they're not causes of poverty. It's the other way around, reverse causality. Being poor is what causes you to have no color TV, not to eat ice cream. So, and the same point with education. Having better education helps you to be non-poor, yes. But it's also true that being non-poor, being richer, helps you to have better education. The causality runs both ways. But if we want to use education as an instrument for reducing poverty, we have to know what causes what, not what's correlated with what. So that's the end of my attack on the World Bank. So much for my career as a consultant for the World Bank, I'm sorry to say. Okay, so what does a poverty profile tell us? It tells us things that are correlated with poverty, not what causes it. And right, and it's causality that we need to know. So in economic research, there's our big problem, identifying causality. Now, if we were chemists or plant scientists, here's what we do. We have a randomized controlled experiment. We take a treatment group and a control group, and we randomly assign observations between those two groups. And we apply some treatment to one group and not the other group. Everything else is the same, a randomized controlled experiment. And then we observe the difference between the treatment and the control group. And that's causality. And we attribute causality to the treatment caused the difference that we observe. Problem is, in economics, people don't like us to do experiments on them. They don't like that. And it costs a fortune if we do. Some research in economics is using randomized controlled experiments, but most of our data are not based on randomized controlled experiments. They're based on data generated through some other process. So this is the problem of economic research, to extract from information that is not randomized controlled experiments knowledge about causality, not knowledge about correlation. That's not useful for policy purposes. Could be totally misleading. You see why it would be so misleading. If I told you that subsidized ice cream was a way of reducing poverty in the Philippines, everyone would understand that that's rubbish, because not eating ice cream isn't the cause of poverty, it's the result of poverty. That the reason we disagree with that policy prescription is because we understand what causes what. So that's the problem in economics, identifying causality. Right. Bit of propaganda there. So measuring poverty incidence. How do we measure poverty incidence? Here's the way economics measures poverty incidence. We construct this thing called the cumulative distribution of expenditures. Now, there are two ways of measuring poverty out there in the literature. One is based on expenditures, one is based on incomes. They don't give the same answers, but they're closely related. In Myanmar, they use expenditures. That means the value of all of the goods and services that people buy. So that's what expenditures is. So we construct this, we get the survey data on all of these households, and we arrange them according to real expenditure per adult equivalent. Adult equivalent means we form for every household, we look at how many male, how many female, how many children of different ages. We have weights for males, females, and children based on average body size. And we add up the number of people weighted by their the weights that come out of this literature, and we get the number of adult equivalents. If a household has a lot of very young children, suppose there's 2 adults and 5 young children, then that's 7 people in total, but the number of adult equivalents would be less than 7 because the children count for less than 1 adult equivalent each. Right, so there's a literature on that, adult equivalents. And the cumulative distribution takes all their households, arranging them from the one with the lowest expenditure per adult equivalent and all the way to the highest. So this is the richest guy out there. That's the guy who owns San Miguel Beer Corporation. I've no idea what his or her name is, but there's somebody out there, way out there, there's somebody who owns San Miguel, and they'd be the richest. And here's some, down here are some poor households who are struggling to survive in rural, probably mountainous areas. Okay, so we've arranged them from the poorest to the richest. And on the vertical axis, we have percent of population. What this means is it's the percent of the population whose real expenditure per adult equivalent is less than or equal to the amount shown on this axis. So at very low levels of real expenditure, there's not many percentage of the population who have less than or equal to that much expenditure per person. You see that it doesn't intersect with the origin, because if you have no expenditure, you're dead. So we don't count those guys. So only the people who are alive appear on the diagram. Now I have a question for you. This word real appears in economics all the time. What is it? What does real mean? Somebody, please explain to me. What is real? It's the opposite of unreal. Okay, but yeah.
Real stands for
adjusted for inflation.
Right. Adjusted for the level of prices. Yeah. Right, exactly correct. Thank you very much. You go to the top of the class, you get an A. He's almost, I should have said the front of the class, and he's almost there already. Right, so as we go up to higher levels of real expenditures, please go back. As we go up to higher levels of real expenditures, there's a higher proportion of the population that has less than or equal to that much real expenditure per adult equivalent, until we get to that guy who owns San Miguel, and 100% of the population have less than, or 99.999% of the population have less than or equal to that much expenditure. These cumulative distributions always are S-shaped. S, not straight lines, because most of the population is concentrated in this middle area. They're always S-shaped. Right, now, someone tells us what the poverty line is. I let the government statisticians tell me what the poverty line is. I never argue about what the poverty line should be for that particular country, because according to my understanding, the distinction between the person whose Non-poor, that's all these guys. And the people who are, beg your pardon, people who are poor, that's people with less than the poverty line. People who are non-poor are above the poverty line. That distinction is arbitrary. It's an opinion. It's an opinion. So I let the government statisticians, the people in the Philippine Statistical Authority, they say what that number is. For the Philippines, that's fine. For Myanmar, somebody in the Ministry of Planning and Coordination in the Myanmar government tells me what the poverty line is. That's it. I keep the poverty line constant in real terms over time. I never argue about the poverty line, but not everybody agrees with me on this. Some people think that the poverty line has an objective scientific meaning, that you can do some research to find out what the poverty line is. And my view is it's a matter of opinion, end of discussion. You tell me what it is, I won't argue. So there's the poverty line that the government tells me. And what's poverty incidence? It's that much. It means that that's the percentage of the population who have less than or equal to this much real expenditure per adult equivalent, less than or equal to. Okay, now we do some kind of analysis, and we find out that something that we change shifts the distribution of that cumulative distribution of real expenditures from, I beg your pardon, right, from the blue line to the dashed orange line. And poverty incidence comes down according to this shift in the cumulative distribution. Now, here's the point that I want to try to convey. It's a subtle point. It's that the counterfactual distribution that I've labeled there is something that we don't actually see. We don't observe it. What we observe is the data told us what actually was out there. We did the survey. We found out that poverty incidence was P0 using this poverty line. Right, that poverty line. And we want to talk about what happens with a land reform or a subsidy for ice cream or an improved education system or some kind of income redistribution scheme. We want to know how much would that reduce poverty, holding everything else constant. Now, remember my story about the scientist, the plant scientist, who conducts the controlled experiment, two groups, the treatment and the control, randomly assigns plants to the two groups and applies the treatment to one, the treatment and not the control. Everything else the same, observes the difference. Then that scientist can attribute the difference to the difference between the treatment and the control to the treatment he applies or she applies. But in economics, we almost never have that. We have to imagine the counterfactual. We have to construct it. We need some kind of analysis to imagine the counterfactual. Data do not exist for the counterfactual because it's something that hasn't happened. It's something we imagine. And what we will say is, having imagined a counterfactual for land reform or whatever change it is, then we will say that the difference between the observed distribution and the counterfactual, that's the effect of this policy or shock or whatever it was that we experimented with. Here's the subtle point. We do not observe the counterfactual. Therefore, constructing the counterfactual is never a problem of data. We may use some data to construct the counterfactual, but data can't tell us what is the counterfactual unless we have a controlled experiment. And in economics, almost never. So there's the fundamental point to understand. It's that we really would love to have controlled experiments, but we almost never do in economics. So most of our economic research is all about trying to construct a counterfactual when we don't actually have the controlled experiment that we would like to have. So we imagine it. So that's what general equilibrium models and econometrics and all that, that's what it's all about, trying to construct the counterfactual. The counterfactual here would be, what would be the distribution, cumulative distribution of real expenditures if we had a land reform? But the land reform hasn't occurred in Myanmar. There's never been a land reform in Myanmar. So we want to figure out what a land reform would do. Hypothetically, if they had a land reform, what would it do? We have to imagine the counterfactual. Hope I've conveyed that point. That's a fundamental problem in economics. Right, the Myanmar data on poverty incidence. Here they are. Please don't worry too much about most of it. Just look at this part. Look at the annual change between 2005 and 2015. So that's a decade that included 2010. 2010 was my year of data. Remember that? 2010, right in the middle of 2005 and 2015. How much was real consumption expenditure? Consumption and expenditure mean the same thing here, per adult equivalent. That's what per AE means. How much was it going up per year? Well, not much. Myanmar was slowly growing during that decade, slowly growing, not much improvement, less than 2% per annum increase in real consumption expenditure per adult equivalent. The expenditure part means that the consumption is measured in money. What happened to poverty incidence? Well, it was coming down, but slowly coming down per year at a national level, 1.27%, and urban areas and rural areas, 1.25. Now, my discussion in this seminar is all about rural poverty. It was coming down at 1.25%. Please remember that number, 1.25%. It was the annual reduction. What that means is, on average, each year, poverty incidence goes down from a number like 25 to a number like 23.75% of the population. 25% one year, 23.75% the next year, 22.5% the next year, like that, year after year, on average, over that decade, on average. Inequality was going up a bit. Okay, so that's... Here are those data. The data that I just showed you on rural poverty and urban poverty are graphed here. These numbers are the same as the ones that I just showed you, total poverty. So rural poverty, pretty well going down in a straight line. We have data for 2005, 2010, 2015, based on surveys like my big survey that I talked about with the 11,000 households. Let's just focus on the rural households for now. That was the rate at which it was coming down. So my research question is, what's the maximum increase reduction in poverty that you could get by redistributing land in Myanmar? The maximum. How different would this diagram look if you had a redistributive land reform? Now, in Myanmar, over this period, there was no land reform. Zero. In fact, there never has been any land reform in Myanmar. So none of this reduction that we see there was caused by land reform, it was caused by other stuff. Moderate amount of economic growth. That's the main driver. Okay. How would the diagram look? And if we do this at the national level, right. Okay, now my methodology. I hate this clicker. Please. Sorry about this. The big problem in economics is in order to imagine a counterfactual, you have to get technical. All right, now, I'm not going to go through the detail of all that in this seminar. Phew, thank goodness. So, but if you want to get those details, what you have to do is send me an email message. And when the paper is written, I will send it to you. I haven't written the paper yet because that's why I give the seminar. I never write the paper before I give the seminar. In the case of the Krugman paper, okay, I've already written the paper. And you can, by sending me an email message, I'll give you my email address. You can get the Krugman paper right now, stolen copyright from that book. But this paper doesn't exist yet. I give the seminar like right now because it helps me to write the paper. Selfish, I know. That's what I do. It helps. In order to write well and clearly, you must understand deeply. Step one, understand deeply. If you don't understand deeply, you cannot explain clearly. So I give the seminar, I give the seminar, I give the seminar, and then I write the paper. In the meantime, walang paper. Okay, so I'll just explain intuitively the method that's used, only intuitively. The method is we run a regression, which regresses the dependent variable, that's the log of expenditure per adult equivalent, against all of these right-hand side variables. The L's are the amount of land that people have per adult equivalent. And all these and these are regions, dummy variables for regions. And these are about 58 control variables, stuff like age of children, education of everybody in the household, head of household, male, female. Do they have a bank account? Do they have this? Lots of control variables, 58 of them. Luckily, this big survey has all this stuff in it. And the purpose of this equation is to identify the causal relationship between all this right-hand side stuff, including how much land you have, and the dependent variable, which is education. Causal. Now, the first thing we do is to run OLS. Please put up your hand if you've ever heard of OLS. Never heard of it? Yeah, this lady is, what is it? Please. You, yeah, lady, yeah, yep. What's OLS? No, just speak up. Ordinary least squares. Brilliant, thank you. Yeah. Ordinary least squares. Now, here's the problem with ordinary least squares. It doesn't necessarily identify causality because some of the right-hand side variables could be endogenous. So to deal with that problem, we use a technique called instrumental variables. So what we do, the variables that are potentially endogenous and are most concerning are these land variables, L. So what we do is we run an instrumental variable two-stage approach. Stage one, we regress these endogenous variables, the L's, the land holdings, against an exogenous instrument. Luckily, I have an exogenous instrument. Now, the reason that the land variables could be endogenous is this. What if, when you get richer, you buy more land? What if? Then it wouldn't be the amount of land that you have that causes you to be rich or poor, causes you to, it would be the other way around. Reverse causality. Oops, the very thing that I criticized the World Bank for, I would be guilty of myself if that was true. So I've got to have a way of dealing with that. Instrumental variables is a way of dealing with it. We find an exogenous instrument. My exogenous instrument is how much land the household inherited years ago from their parents. Whether you're rich or not, how you're doing, doesn't really determine how much land you got from your parents. That must be exogenous. So I run that regression. That's the first stage regression. The endogenous variable, ownership of land, against the exogenous instrument, which is how much land you inherited, and all the control variables. That's the first stage regression. Luckily, it worked well. Trust me, you have no choice. And then the second stage regression in the instrumental variable approach uses the predicted level of the endogenous variable, how much land you have, as inserts that into the equation and uses that in the regression, the predicted level. That's instrumental variables. It's a way of dealing with endogeneity. See what it's really about. What it's about is overcoming the problem that we do not have a randomized controlled experiment. That's always the starting point for our econometric problems in economics. We don't have the randomized controlled experiments. So we're trying to do something that simulates what the result of the randomized controlled experiment would be like. That's what instrumental variable methods do. So whereas ordinary least squares has a potential problem of endogeneity of the right-hand side variables, instrumental variable methods potentially overcome it imperfectly. Imperfectly. We never get to the equivalent of a randomized controlled experiment. So I like to say that we have two methods in economics. There's ordinary least squares and there's extraordinary least squares, and instrumental variable methods are the extraordinary. That's all I'm going to say about this. I'm going to tell you, and then what I do with land is, having estimated this equation, both in OLS and instrumental variables, then I redistribute the land. I'm going to save time by showing you only the results in which land is redistributed completely. There are two kinds of land that are important, that are distinguished in these data: irrigated, non-irrigated. They're different. So we equalize the distribution of all the irrigated land. Everyone gets the mean. And we equalize the distribution of the unirrigated land. Everybody gets the mean. And then we substitute those equalized amounts of land back into the estimated equation that we estimated up there, OLS and instrumental variables, and we predict what the distribution of expenditures would be. That's our counterfactual. If you understood that very quick explanation, I salute you, because it was so very quick. I don't have time for much else. I see it as 5 o'clock already. So here's the idea. We use that trick that I just described, that statistical trick, for simulating what the counterfactual distribution would be like if we had the randomized controlled experiment, approximating it with that trick that I just described. OLS, instrumental variables. And then we're going to find out how much poverty would come down if we did that. And regression results. And let's not, right, here they are. Here are the OLS results. I'm showing you only the results that relate to those L variables up there. These are the OLS results. Everything's significant. You know, when you have a survey with 11,000 observations in it, everything's significant, just about everything. So it's really not very helpful to say, oh, I did my regression and this variable is statistically significant. Everything, all the control variables, they're all significant because the number of observations is so big. All it means when you say something is significant is you're comparing the estimated coefficient with its standard error. That's all you're doing. But the standard errors, when you have a large sample like 11,000, standard errors are low. So everything's significant, almost everything. So it's not that the fact that something is statistically significant doesn't mean that it's big, doesn't mean that it's economically significant, doesn't mean that it's important. That's a big mistake you see all the time. You see student presentations when they say, oh, I did the regression and it's statistically significant. Therefore, that's the answer to my question and that's the end of the paper. No, the fact that it's statistically significant does not mean that it's important, does not mean that its effect is big. It might be a small effect, might be tiny, but it has a low standard error. That's all. Right, so you'll be pleased to hear we do this for OLS and instrumental variable methods, and the results, look at these coefficients. The important things are irrigated, owned, unirrigated. These are the coefficients. They're not very different. The instrumental variable coefficients are a bit bigger. Okay, so I use them, a bit bigger. So then I construct my counterfactual based on the instrumental variable results. And if the clicker would only work, right. Keep going. Right. Let's skip over that. Skip over that. Yep. No, you're going in the wrong direction. Keep. Yes, right. Here's the answer. Here's the end. Wow, thank goodness. Here's the end. How much did poverty come down? Answer, 1.3% when you use the OLS estimates, 1.3%. That's a one-off. You redistribute land completely. Everybody gets the mean amount of land. Every household gets the mean. So the variance of the distribution of land is 0. Everybody gets the mean. According to this counterfactual calculation, everybody gets the mean. OLS, according to the OLS coefficients, poverty incidence comes down by 1.2% of the population, rural population. That's rural poverty incidence. And the OLS coefficients, you remember they were a bit bigger, 1.7% was the reduction. So what's the answer to my question? How much did poverty incidence come down? Don't worry about that. Don't worry about that. Don't worry about that. Don't do this. Right. Remember that? There was the data on how much, what poverty incidence actually was in I beg your pardon, in Myanmar. I'm tired now. In Myanmar, over this 10-year period. How much would it have come down if we had done that hypothetical land reform? How much would it come down? That much, 1.7%, which is just a bit over. Remember, I asked you to remember one number? It was the amount by which rural poverty incidence was coming down each year, not due to land reform. Does anyone remember that number? What was it? 1.25. So if you had the complete redistribution of land, then you would get a once only reduction. That's a redistribution that can never be repeated. Once you have equal, there's no more redistribution that you can consider. That would reduce poverty by 1.7%. That's all. That's all. So I draw the following conclusion. Land reform is not a particularly effective. It would reduce poverty. Yes, of course it would. Land is an asset. Land is an important productive asset. Redistributing land, making its distribution equal, would make the distribution of income more equal and reduce poverty. Yes, but not much. Only a reduction of 1.7% of the rural population. So that's a reduction of, say, 25, what was the number? 29.2 there, minus 1.7, that looks like 27.5. A reduction, 27.5 in 2010, and that's a permanent reduction. Forever, the distribution of land is more equal. Well, I don't know whether you're as tired as I am, but I want to know the answer to the professor's point. What's the missing link? Why is it that land reform doesn't reduce poverty nearly as much as Professor Michael Lipton and my former teacher, Professor Amartya Sen, all think, and all those other heavies, Jeffrey Sachs and Dancy Birdsall and all those other superstars. They all think land reform is a very effective way to reduce poverty. Why are they mistaken? According to me, that's the maximum reduction in poverty that you could get. Any practical land reform could never equalize land distribution as much as I have in this hypothetical experiment. So actual land reform could reduce poverty only by less than that. Only less than that. So it's not very impressive, but you could reduce poverty, but not much. So my comment is, if you want to reduce poverty in Myanmar, land reform is a very costly and a very ineffective way of reducing poverty. Why? What's the missing link? Why? It seemed that land reform was a great idea, but it turns out not to do much. Why? The answer is, it's a problem of targeting. The problem is that the people who have more land are not necessarily the non-poor. Many poor people have a lot of land. It's just not very productive. People who have less land are not necessarily the poor. The way to target the poor is not the most effective way to target the poor, is to look at their expenditure per person, per adult equivalent, not to look at how much land they have, because that is poorly correlated with whether they're poor or not. It's a problem of poverty targeting. Focusing on distribution of only one asset, that's land, is an ineffective way of targeting the poor. That's why you get results like that. And that's why Professor Michael Lipton is mistaken. His heart is in the right place. Go back to the joke that I told before about the economist whose heart hadn't been used. That's not Professor Michael Lipton. His heart is in the right place. And all those other guys who said kind things about this book, their heart's in the right place too. But we have to have our mind in the right place as well and look at the evidence, what works and what doesn't work. And according to me, land reform is not a particularly effective way of reducing poverty. There are better ways. What are they? Raise productivity. Raise productivity, improve education, improve infrastructure, improve the technology that farmers have by research that's relevant for your country and extension. Research and development plus extension plus infrastructure improvement. These are the ways to reduce poverty because they improve the productivity of all the farmers. Redistributive measures chew up tremendous bureaucratic and political capital, and they don't work very well because they target poverty only very imperfectly. And there's my email address. If you want the Krugman paper, send me an email address and you can have it now. If you want the land reform paper, send me a message asking for it. You're going to have to wait for me to write the paper.
Yes, sure. I can give you another one later if you want. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Warr. I actually learned a lot with your two presentations. All right, actually, we are now at the question and answer portion of our agenda. So I am opening the floor. For those who have questions, please approach any of the mics that are strategically located in our venue. And please identify yourself, maybe just the name and the organization, or if you're a student, what are you taking? And you can address your question to Peter or whoever else is here from SEARCA. If you have questions about SEARCA, that's also okay. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank everyone who came. We have over 120 signups for this ADSS. Drillon Hall is only supposed to fit 50 comfortably, so we're SEARCA is definitely overwhelmed with the response of UPLB to this event. We also have about 50 people watching over Facebook Live. Well, at least the last time I checked. So questions, please. Floor is open.
Hello.
I think I'm going to have to come out today.
Mic test.
You can sit down if you want.
No, I'd rather stand up.
Okay, sure. Okay.
It's the second page from the unmarked.
Okay. Thanks, Peter. I know you're tired, but go ahead.
Hi, I'm Mark from the UP Agricultural and Applied Economics SEARCA. I major in natural resource economics. My question is with regards to the second presentation, which was mostly about land reform. I think sorry, English.
Can you
I
speak
think-
Thai? That would be okay.
Sure. I think it was clear from the presentation that land reform was not as efficient as we expected, only reducing rural poverty by 1.7%, which is small. And I'd like to know what is considered at what point would it be considered effective in terms of poverty incidence? I hope my question is clear.
Very clear. Thank you. I want to emphasize that I am not saying that land reform in the Philippines would reduce poverty incidence by only 1.7%. I have no idea. I don't know. I haven't studied that. So I didn't mean to say that. I hope no one thinks I meant that. That would be a great research topic, because I suspect that in the Philippines, the distribution of land is more unequal than it is in Myanmar. I suspect that. It would be a very good research topic. At what point? Okay, great question. And for sure, there's no straightforward answer. It's ultimately a political decision. Our job as economists, as researchers, is not to say to, for example, Secretary Arsenio Balisacan at NEDA, Dr. Balisacan, you should or should not have land reform. No, our job is to say, if you do land reform, here will be the effects according to our analysis based on these assumptions. Always there's a long list of those assumptions. That's all. And beyond that, it's a political decision. It's a government decision. That's why we have democracy. Nobody elected me to make any decisions about these kinds of things. So my job is to supply the policymakers, this is the way I see it, supply the policymakers with information based on quality research that distinguishes between causality and correlation. That's the first fundamental thing that we must do. But then the judgment as to how much reduction in poverty due to land reform would be a justification. That is a political decision. That is why we have elections. We have elections to elect the people who make those decisions, not me. So I hope that my answer was clear.
Thank you. I have a follow-up question regarding the first topic this time. I'm not sure if the question is as popular in other countries, but a common discourse here in the economics community in the country is that the Philippines is or is not an agricultural country. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. Some would argue that the Philippines is not, mostly on the basis of employment and output. Some would argue that it is, since, of course, agriculture is still the primary sector. So what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, the Philippines is more like Thailand and Indonesia in those data that I showed than it is like Singapore and Hong Kong. It's nothing like Singapore and Hong Kong. There's still a large agricultural sector. And that agricultural sector is contracting over time, both as a share of GDP and as a share of employment. Now, let me expand further on that. Some people think that this process of structural transformation is a bad thing. They don't like it. Or romantic ideas about agriculture. Look at the guy who loves the buffalo and he loves the farm and so on. That's romanticizing agriculture. Actually, agriculture is tough. Farming is tough. It's a hard life. And most farmers are poor. So the contraction of agriculture and people moving to higher productivity employment elsewhere in the economy, I don't see this as a bad thing. I think it's good. And it is a fundamental feature, an inescapable feature of economic development. If you want economic development, you will have to accept structural transformation. So what's the policy message? Policy message is the government should not try to restrict the movement of people out of agriculture. That is a stupid idea because it confines them to poverty. No, the policy message is facilitate the process of structural transformation by helping people when they leave agriculture and go to the city to have a good life in the city, good housing, improve the urban infrastructure, the education system, deal with pollution, things that the government in your country and in all the countries of Asia are doing already. Try to don't make it necessary for people who are forced to leave agriculture to live in slums like Tondo. Actually make it possible for them to live a better life with good housing, better employment opportunities, good public infrastructure, good education. That's the number one thing.
Thank you.
More question. The professor had a question about the first paper, but I've chased her away. I take it she is a professor, right? Yes. What's her name? What's her name? Bello. Okay, yeah. Any other question? I'll try to be nice, but it's difficult for me to be nice when I'm so tired. Sigue. Voilà. Okay. Tapos na.
Please give Peter Warr another round of applause.